Brian. Thank you, everyone. Let me share my screen with you. So today I'd like to talk to you about my research project, which is a large part of a larger multi-year project, which is called Gulag Shadow. And it's a project funded by European Social Research Council, with universities of Strathclyde, Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, Russia, and in Nazarbayev University. And Gavin Slade, he's here with us. He's a co-principal investigator in this project. And so today I'd like to talk to you about one small part of this, is about this relationship between public views about criminal punishment and actual delivery of this criminal punishment in Kazakhstan. So I ask three questions. When we study criminal justice systems in non-democratic regimes, we think of it as often as an instrument or some kind of tool for the regime. So yet we also notice that very often leaders in these countries, they also choose to reform their criminal justice systems. It means that they are dissatisfied at some point with their functioning. So that raises a question that maybe it's under some conditions, these criminal justice systems may be a liability to the regime. One possible source of this dissatisfaction may be citizens' dissatisfaction. They want criminals to be punished a certain way, but the official law enforcement system, criminal justice system, does not punish them this way. And then the third question is how and why are criminals persecuted and punished in the ways they are in non-democracies. So what do we know from the existing research? So this section is the literature review section for our students who write their own papers probably this time. So what do we know about criminal justice systems in autocracies? The first is major finding is that criminal justice is usually viewed as an asset for the regime, and it's used mainly for the purpose of controlling the society. So one finding that we have is that more criminal suspects are arrested, more prosecuted defendants are convicted. So this is that accusation bias of law enforcement system. And more convicted criminals are incarcerated or receive longer prison sentences than in democracies. The second finding from the existing research is that authoritarian leaders can easily manipulate criminal justice system and secure its loyalty so that they can achieve and maintain their political regimes. So in other words, the idea here is that they can easily reform their criminal justice systems if they don't like how they function through the mix of co-optation, corruption, and threats or oppression. The third finding is that unlike democracies, autocracies and their criminal justice systems tend to be less accountable to the voters, to the ordinary people. And therefore, they are more autonomous and they're able to punish or not behavior not in the ways citizens prefer. So these are the three findings: that it's used for social control, it's easily reformed, changed, manipulated, and that it's less accountable to the public. So they can punish, they can be more autonomous in choosing a certain punishment of certain offenders. So then this leads to the possibility that a mismatch or a gap exists between what public expects about criminal punishment and the actual practices of prosecuting and sentencing criminals. And today I focus on this mismatch, try to find this nature and then the magnitude of this mismatch using the case of Kazakhstan. So if we zoom in on this mismatch, we can say that mismatch between expectations and the actual delivery of criminal punishment may be an asset. It may pull citizens to official law under certain conditions. If it offers moral guidance, so for example, like on this picture, if police officers are role models for ordinary people. Yeah, so this picture is from the Soviet period, Soviet era cartoon about the Uncle Stepa, Uncle Stefan, who was a very good militiaman, militia officer. So if it raises standards of fairness, if it promotes rehabilitation of victims and resocialization of offenders so they don't repeat their crimes and become law-abiding citizens. But this mismatch also can be a liability. It may push citizens away from the official law. So for example, if punishment is too harsh, then it may radicalize those affected by harsh criminal sanctions or police torture, like these relatives on this photo. These are relatives and friends of victims of torture, of those people who were arrested during the January unrest in Kazakhstan just a few months ago. And this mismatch can also be a liability when punishment is too lenient or when police does nothing. So then it may lead to impunity. So it will not deter further crimes, and it may result in victims of crimes seeking vigilante justice. Yeah, take the justice in their own hands. So some of you may remember about in July 2020, there was a big unrest in the city of Satpayev in Karaganda province when the mob surrounded the building where they were trying to catch the suspected pedophile. So as a result, we have a criminal case now. They burned the bus. They fought with police. So we have 64 victims of that unrest and 54 defendants, including women and teenagers. So now I would like you to answer this question. I'm going to try to launch this poll before we get to actual Kazakhstan. Case selection and the empirical evidence. So if you, can you see the poll on your screen? So if you could choose a punishment for the repeat offender, a person who found guilty of entering apartment or house and stealing a TV set. Okay, so we have just going to share the results. So as you can see from the results, we have about quarter of answers prison sentence. Just keep this number in your memory. Quarter of our group is for prison sentence. Just keep that item in mind. And so why focus on Kazakhstan when to answer these questions about criminal justice reforms and this mismatch between public expectations of punishment and actual delivery of punishment? So the first is that Kazakhstan has been a very dynamic and rapidly changing its attitude towards criminal punishment. So in 1996, in that time, Kazakhstan experienced the surge in the crime rate, and it also was very punitive in terms of delivery of punishment. In 1998, it was a third in the world in terms of, if you count the prison population, after the United States and Russia. But by 2019, its prison population drastically declined. In 2019, it went down to 100th place in the world, so somewhere in the middle. If we can see, this is the statistics. We can see that until 2021, the last 20 years, prison population steadily declined. If we think about prison population rate, so this is the number of prisoners divided by 100,000 of population, we see that it also went down almost 4 times until 2021. So this means the change of criminal punishment practices is possible. Yeah, some kind of reform in Kazakhstan is possible. So then it makes sense to check out Kazakhstan, why try to see the reform trajectory. It also is paradoxical because growing autocratization or strengthening or consolidation of the authoritarian regime since 1990s led to less punitive criminal justice system. So fewer people arrested for crimes, fewer people receive sentences for crimes, and fewer defendants actually sentenced to prison. So this goes against this theoretical expectation that that argues that democratization is actually leads to less punitive criminal justice system. The second is that we unfortunately had a crisis in Kazakhstan in July 2018. The 2 thieves killed Olympic Prize winner Dennis Ten, very famous figure skater, in the daylight in the center of Almaty. And so the public was outraged. It demanded reform of police, on the Ministry of Internal Affairs. President Nazarbayev even said in Atirau, when he visited, publicly announced that maybe we should reform Kazakhstani police the Georgian way, the Georgian style reform. Yeah? And so did this public outcry and outrage and demands for punishing the thieves, yeah, and those thieves was later revealed that they were repeat, so they were recidivists. They already had 2 convictions for stealing, for robbery. Okay, and so did this result in change in behavior of prosecuting and behavior of judges in terms of punishing? And then we have also another interesting thing in Kazakhstan is that President Tokayev, when he came, since he came to power in mid-2019, he approved the toughening of criminal penalties. He actually changed the criminal code 25 times in the last 3 years. Okay, yet the January 22 unrest in several cities in Kazakhstan showed that this deterrence, that harsher criminal penalties did not scare criminals. Yeah, we saw in videos and photos of looters, of people who engaged in violence or engaged in massive theft. Yeah? So again, did this harshening of penalties in the last 3 years, did it change behavior of police and judges in punishing criminals? So I focus on this mismatch between expected and actual criminal punishment in Kazakhstan by using the following data and methods. First, I use data from the International Crime Victims Survey conducted in May and June 2014, so 1 month before the murder of Denis Ten. So this was funded by the European Union, a project on support of criminal justice reform. It was 4,000 respondents in the country, including 1,000 in Almaty and 1,000 in Astana. I also use data collected in the project that I'm part of, the European Social Research Council funded a big public opinion survey about criminal punishment in October 2019. So this sample was a nationally representative stratified sample of 1,600 respondents. And then I analyzed official crime prosecution, court, and prison statistics, comparing them between before and after July 2018. How do I define social punitiveness? I borrow a definition of this concept from the work of Adriansen and Artsen, and they conceive this as a 4-dimensional concept. There's societal attitudes along the following dimensions: the goal of punishment, the form of punishment, the intensity of punishment, and the attitudes to specific policies. And I focus here today only on 2 dimensions. So the form of punishment, meaning prison sentence or non-prison sentence. And then the intensity of punishment is the length. So if it's a prison sentence that people wish to use for punishment, then how long the sentence should be. Evidence about social attitudes towards police is we see that public opinion is negative of police, and this creates a liability for the political regime. This is confirmed by the findings of the 2018 survey, so this which was done before murder of Denis Ten, and we see that we found that only 1 in 4 of victims of theft or burglary, which are the most common crimes in Kazakhstan, they were satisfied with police action. So a large majority is dissatisfied. And low satisfaction with performance of police in controlling crime is a variable which has an impact of punitiveness at the individual level. So if people who don't like how police is doing its job in fighting crime, they are more likely to prefer harsher punishment. And so far what we see on the data from the 2 surveys is that public opinion in Kazakhstan is increasingly punitive. We ask the same question, just like I asked you this question a few minutes ago about the punishment for a hypothetical recidivist burglar, young man who had been found guilty of breaking in and stealing a TV set. And as you can see, 2018 survey, 28% of respondents chose imprisonment. So this is almost similar to what we had in our group. Yeah, we had 25% of. So in other words, our group is similar to Kazakhstan before July 2018, before the this outrageous murder of Denis Ten. But in 2019, it was 2 out of 3 respondents chose imprisonment. So the public opinion, we could say, turned 180 degrees. And what type of punishment or what length of prison sentence, we asked respondents, and we see that basically on 4 out of 5 preferred sentence of a prison term of 2 years or longer. When we asked an abstract question about should all convicted defendants be sentenced to prison, we received 71% agreeing or strongly agreeing. So this is this punitiveness is, if we compare it to responses of Europeans, so European social survey asked the same question. It's in Kazakhstan, it's much harsher, much more punitive. When we compare Russia and Kazakhstan, so we did a similar survey, was conducted in 2019 in Russia. The same question was asked, and we can see that in Kazakhstan, public seems to be less punitive. 66% chose imprisonment versus 80% in Russia. On length of sentence, it's basically similar. And when we asked about the should all convicted defendants be sentenced to prison, we see that in Kazakhstan, actually, it's higher proportion of respondents, 71% versus 56 preferred that option. And theft of TVs is common in Kazakhstan. So here you can see these are just news reports from the last 3 years. You know, the thieves in Kazakhstan, sometimes they even steal 2 TVs at the same time. And as you can see from this news in Shymkent, that actually one babushka did not trust police and found the burglar by herself without a police help. Okay. So now let's move on to what actually police and prosecutors and judges do in terms of punishing. Using official crime statistics, we see again the change. So between 2018 and 2021, last 4 years, we see in the past, it was only half of cases that were sent to court. In other words, only half of them actually had a police completed them by sending to court. But in 2021, almost every case, 93%, was sent to court. In Almaty and Astana, we have the same trajectory. If 4 years ago, it was only half of cases that was sent to courts. And these are the solved cases. When the suspect was identified, yeah, half of them was simply closed based on reconciliation with the victim. But in 2021, we see all of them going to court. What happens during the trial in Kazakhstan? Again, the trajectory is very clear. We see that 4 years ago, about a quarter of cases received a sentence. But in 2021, last year, it was 9 out of 10. Yeah, if 4 years ago, courts tended to close these cases and based on reconciliation with the victim, yeah, when defendants simply paid back or returned the stolen property or compensated the victim, the case was closed without a sentence and no punishment. But now, last year, we see that only 2% were closed this way, and most of them received the sentence. Here, this table shows the percentage of persons of the thieves and burglar, and we see the same trend. Yeah, from the minority of them getting a sentence 4 years ago to 83% of them getting a sentence. In Almaty, the same trajectory. Yeah, as you can see here from the last column, we see the percentage of people who, of defendants who were released from jail. So they were given either very short prison sentence or they were given non-prison sentence. In Astana, the situation again shows that more and more defendants are sentenced, but very few, well, almost, I mean, none of them were actually released from jail. So in other words, they were either they were given a prison sentence or they were not arrested before the trial. And this is the punishment. This table shows the punishment types and length of sentence, so prison sentence, for repeat theft and burglary in the last 4 years. So again, the percentage is growing. So if 4 years ago, we see that only 7% of defendants in these crimes were sentenced to prison. But last year, we see it's 30%. Yeah, the length of punishment, the length of prison term also grew from 1% to 17%. But still, the most popular punishment is this one mentioned in blue. It's so-called restriction of freedom. So this is basically a punishment that defendants, they serve at their homes. So they have restrictions. For example, they are not allowed to visit restaurants or any kind of public gatherings. They have to be at home at night, and they can only go to work and come back, when they leave a house and so forth. So non-prison sentence. This is the most popular punishment that judges hand out for this crime. In Almaty, we see the same trend. Restriction of freedom is the most popular. The share of those sentenced to prison is growing, just like in the nationwide. And in Astana is the same thing, just like in Almaty and in the rest of the country. So if we take the stock of this mismatch between public expectation of criminal punishment for theft and burglary and the actual punishment, we see that prosecutors and judges are much more lenient than the public. Yes, the gap of the mismatch is shrinking, it's narrowing, but it's still, as you can see, the comparison between public opinion expectation and the official crime statistics, we see that the gap is still wide. So the length of the sentence, as you can see, 80% of public expects at least 2 years, but the judges sentenced to prison for at least 3 years is only 17%. Yeah, and in Almaty and Astana, the actual on average they are less. They receive shorter. The larger portion of offenders receive a shorter sentence. On the abstract question about sentencing to prison, yeah, 71% public opinion, but last year was only 41% of convicted defendants were sentenced to prison. And to conclude, I make 3 tentative conclusions. The first one is that the large yet narrowing gap between what public wants from criminal justice it wants fairness through punitiveness. And what criminal justice delivers, which is perceived impunity for criminals and leniency for them without fairness. We can see that from the type and intensity of punishment, this mismatch is large, but it's narrowing. Sorry. And the second is that this mismatch between what president wants from criminal justice, and he always mentions tough punishment, and this is one element of populism, yeah, because politicians like to be tough on crime. Law and order and their responsibility for maintaining law and order, they usually score points. And so this mismatch between his and public announcements and what criminal justice actually delivers, we see that judges and prosecutors responded only after the change of criminal code. So these are those harsh and stricter punishments that President Tokayev introduced, and they still prefer non-prison sentences. So the people who were arrested and convicted for the riots in Almaty, for example, so now many of them are already receiving sentences, and most of them, I guess the easiest cases, yeah, the most of the looters receive non-prison sentence. So they receive that restriction of freedom. And finally, the third tentative conclusion is that Kazakhstan's criminal justice system is behaving more and more as expected by the existing research. So that we see more punitiveness, more defendants are arrested, more of them are actually convicted with sentences, and a higher proportion of them receives prison sentence. So it's behaving more as expected, but at the same time, it seems to be increasingly responsive to the public expectations. Of course, responsiveness is not the same as accountability, but if we use anecdotal evidence, we see a lot of hype in social media, for example, or some kind of collective gatherings of people demanding justice. And only after that hype in social media or on the streets, police, prosecutors, and judges are becoming more harsh and actually doing their job according to the expectations of the public. So thank you very much for your attention. This is all what I wanted to share with you. So I would like to hear your feedback, comments, and questions. And one area specifically that I would like your help is about populism, of how to stronger, tighter connected to the to my argument. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. So right now we'll open it up for questions and comments. You can raise your hand or put a message in the chat, and then we'll proceed that way. So any questions or comments? Akmaral.
Is it necessary to record these questions?
I can cut off the record. Hold on one second.
Pause. Yeah.
Okay, Maya.
Thank you, Alexei, for this wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. I knew nothing about the justice system, the criminal penal code of the country. So very interesting data there. I just wonder what is the one question about the intersection of the variables that you mentioned and corruption, right? So there is this low satisfaction with the performance of the police, but what role does corruption play? Because I have heard of few cases here where we have a court decision regarding, let's say, road traffic accident. Somebody, drunk driver, kills a pedestrian or something, and then there are actually a few cases apparently where they are released from prison early, or they're not sentenced at all. So there is like a corruption intermediating between the judiciary decision, even if the judiciary performs and they are somebody is sentenced. And then maybe what we see and what is visible is the release of this convict. So what is maybe that's the reason for the low satisfaction with the performance of the overall police or with the penal code of the country. So what's your opinion on that? What's the discrepancy between actually enforcement of actually even judicial decisions?
Yes, I agree with you, Amaya. Corruption plays a role, and I don't think officials would reject its role. I mean, they understand that it's present. Specifically when it comes with traffic accidents, especially involving, very important persons or locally important persons, yeah. There is always this suspicion, and there are many cases of this suspicious, and that generate actually scandals. In the past, it was possible to reconcile with the victims. So the driver or relatives of the driver, they would simply compensate the victims with money or with some products or pay for their healthcare treatment and so forth. But with recently, or 4 years ago, I think, or 3 years ago, it was abolished. So the possibility of reconciling was abolished, and all these people have to now reach the sentencing stage and punishment. When it comes to early release of people from prisons, yes, that's also a mystery. These decisions are not public. Public does not participate in them, and the media is not allowed. And there was scandals already about that people were released, and then they would be put back in prison because they clearly bought their way out. One issue with criminal justice in Kazakhstan is that 88% of or 90% of the defendants are unemployed. So many of them simply do not have money to bribe anyone. It's for many of them, it's just they drink something, poor people drink something and then they steal something or commit some crimes. So that's one issue that we need to keep in mind in thinking that but when it comes to owners of cars, that's middle class or upper middle class, and there is where right now there is a case in Temirtau when the son of a rich person killed on a slippery road, and then this case has been dragging for a long time, and there are all accusations from all sides and hinting at the corruption. And so, yeah, I would say corruption for sure drives investigation, but I would say most crimes do not involve rich people, and very often it's simply police not doing its job, refusing to register a crime. That's a big barrier. So a lot of crime in Kazakhstan, at least what we found in 2018 survey, goes unreported. So we would say that the actual volume of crime is 5 times larger. 20 times larger than official records estimate. And this is one reason of public dissatisfaction in 2018. That in Almaty, people steal parts of cars and nothing. They, police simply does not care about it. It does not respond to the victim. So that would be my answer.
Thank you.
All right, Karina.
Yeah, okay, hello, thank you for your presentation. And I would like to raise a question about the actual effectiveness of those reforms, because as you said, it's very great that Kazakhstani government is very responsive to the public opinions and to the public, grievances about the criminal justice system. But how can government balance between those populist reforms and the actual goals of the sentencing of the prisoners? Because you raised the question about the someone who steal the TV, right? And I've chosen the other option of the sentencing those person, because this is actually the goal of the criminal justice system, is not only to protect the citizens but also to re-educate the criminals. So unless we re-educating them, unless we are doing something to change their mind, to change their social position in the system, we won't gain any effect out of those reforms. So how is there any goal, and how can it be achieved, maybe, if it's not that utopian, maybe?
Yes, Karina, very good point. Thank you for raising this. Yes, actually, the penitentiary, the goal of prisons, one goal of prisons is education. Yeah, they call it correctional, for example, correctional facilities. Yeah, the idea is to rehabilitate and to change the mindset of a prisoner. And so, but of course, this process should start not in prison, but before. Yeah, actually, when police does its whatever search, detective job, and so forth. So we have the Dostoevsky Crime and Punishment. Yeah, when the prosecutor is actually doing all the job of motivating to repent, the further and so forth. So that, I would say, that part is even more difficult to reform. Yeah, I mean, there is a legacy, of course, the Soviet Gulag legacy that is not. I mean, it used to be in Soviet Union when there was a full labor, full employment, labor employment policy. Yeah, so many prisoners simply had jobs, they could get another profession, and so when they come out of prison, they have skills, they can get jobs and start a new life and then do well. In capitalism and in Kazakhstan specifically, there are very few job opportunities or study opportunities in prisons. Yeah, so and this is for. So this is just one example of this. So I totally agree with you that comprehensive criminal justice reform should be much should not focus on harshening the penalties, but actually focusing on the individual and the community in which these individuals live. So it may actually be not about law enforcement officials. Yeah, it may be simply about private sector employment, or psychologists, or therapists, or doctors, or teachers. So people who are far away from criminal justice system. And we know about the youth subculture. Yeah, we know about bullying in schools and all sorts of other type of psychological violence in schools. And so this is where, if we want to achieve a serious result, I think this is, we should start with kindergartens and the families, where domestic violence is has to be condemned and practicing. But so anyway, I agree totally with you that responsiveness is just it's a step, and in my opinion, so far it's a step it's a populist step. In other words, when the leader needs to gain popularity, he promises to be tougher. Yeah. What happens next? We do not know.
Okay, all right. Akjol?
Oh yeah, dear professor, thank you for your presentation. Actually, showing the results of these two surveys in 2018 and 19, you mentioned that the public opinion is increasingly punitive, and I thought it would be interesting to assess it within the context of the punishment delivered by non-official or like self-organized bodies. Well, probably you know that there were some cases of people's mobilization and calls for, I guess it is like lynchivание, or simply like самосуд, especially in cases of pedophilia, as it was in like Satpayev city last October, or also it often happens during the ethnic conflicts, like between Kazakhs and Armenians, Kazakhs and Chechens, Kazakhs and Kurds, and so on. So when I'm interested, are there any other researchers focused on this lynching or самосуд, or do you think that the results of such researchers would correlate with your findings? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Akjol. Yes, as I said, that if there is a mismatch, if people think that police is not doing a job, or if police is on the side with the criminals, for example, yeah, we saw then they take justice in their own hands. Yeah, we call it vigilante justice. And yes, it happens. It happened in the cities or in rural areas. It happened with the traffic accidents, because many drivers who kill or who wound people, then they simply drive away or run away, yeah, from the place, and so forth. I mean, studying these cases is difficult, yeah, especially if law enforcement agencies control the information. If people in the, or they don't allow, let's say, researchers to come and study in these villages or locations, or the people, yeah, and so all people are simply afraid to talk to outsiders. So studying this, I think, is very difficult. When we did this survey in 2018, the first survey, actually just because researchers were asking questions about crime, yeah, if you've been victim of crime, and blah, 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 in one village, they had to run away, because villagers actually thought that these were not researchers but criminals. They were observing, yeah, do you have locks on your doors? So whatever, yeah, so that they were preparing a ground for subsequent robbery. Yeah, and so I would say researching this type of cases, I do not know who does this research. That's, I mean, and so that's, but more and more of these type of incidents, of course, they catch attention of administration of president, of police, yeah, of politicians, and it's possible some of them may pursue their own goals, yeah, to gain this cheap popularity, yeah, to create hype, and then to gain some kind of fame.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, one more question. I mean, in your this research, were there any attempts kind of to see the difference between the attitudes of people coming from urban areas and rural areas, maybe like some different regions and so on?
Well, yes, we in the first survey we had booster samples, so we had larger samples in Almaty and Astana, and I showed that in Almaty and Astana, you know, in 2018 at least, people were slightly more punitive, and then we also had larger samples in the areas where there were higher concentration of Gulag prisons, Gulag labor camps. So in Kazakhstan, it was in Karaganda province, and in Russia, it was in other areas. Yeah, and so we would say that tentatively, we would say on average, people in areas where there were labor camps, in other words, there is a different subculture. Yeah, people remember many prisoners remained in those areas. Yeah, they lived next door to the prison guards who guarded them. So in those areas, at least in Kazakhstan, we see a slightly higher punitiveness. And so that would be my answer. Yeah.
Okay, all right, Karina.
I would like to raise the similar maybe question about the socioeconomic situation. You said that the comprehensive criminal system reform is very important and it needs to be done in order to be effective, in order to make our criminal justice system effective. But is it actually feasible? Because it seems from the first side, like we need to erase the whole generation of the Kazakhstanis in order to start from the fresh paper, and in order to raise them like as a maybe normal society that wouldn't be prone to criminal to some kind of criminal situations. And like don't you think that all of this maybe punishment lead behavior of our citizens is also deep-rooted in the welfare system of our country? Like, is it actually feasible to effectively reform it?
Well, any serious reform carries serious risks for people, for the reformers, for example. Yeah. So is it feasible? I don't think current regime wants to have a serious reform. They would like to have a police that would work like in, United Arab Emirates. Yeah, and they want to have police that's respected, that's modernized. Yeah, it's not. They want police without scandals. Yeah, they don't want, for example, torture. Yeah, we saw January 2022. What happened? So more people are or law enforcement officials are more concerned about economic damage to the property in Almaty, yeah, in other large cities, rather than they are concerned with the lives of people who were tortured. And we know from the reports that there was a massive torture. So what's more important, like damage to property, to some supermarket, or human life? So this is one, let's say, bias that it may be bias of capitalist society. I do not know. But you are right about feasibility at this point. There are theories of generational change. But one example, let's say optimistic example, would be seat belts. Yeah, seat belts in the 1990s in Kazakhstan, very few people wore seat belts when they drove. Yeah, but early 2000s, we see people change behavior, starting wearing seat belts. Yeah, and now it's a normal practice. So in other words, the change. The change is possible. I think this January unrest, yeah, and the shootings and the torture, left a trauma in society. Maybe it will generate more demands for human, because I think Kazakhstani people, they understand that prisons are places for torture. They are not places for correction or rehabilitation. In that sense, January riots, the torture of people who were arrested in these riots showed, they just confirmed that.
Okay, Carol?
I'm curious about the logic of judicial system resistance to this political pressure. So if prosecutors and judges face pressure from the public, and especially from the president, you'd think that they'll have the incentive to adjust their actions. But despite some narrowing in the mismatch that you identify, they don't really do that. And why is that the case? Is it assertion of the independence of the judiciary, which would be quite unusual in an autocracy? Is it something to do with professional norms or something else?
Yeah, that's a good question, Karel. I think a lot of it is bureaucratic inertia. So, the decisions made by president or on top somewhere in Astana, far away, yeah, they trickle down very slowly to the ordinary procurators, in the villages or small towns or Almaty, whatever. And so I think this bureaucratic inertia is one explanation for this. Another thing is that there is, for 20 years, well, almost 20 years, Kazakhstan has been making itself proud that it's reducing prison population. Yeah, and so there was we could say, almost a generation of prosecutors and judges who just simply were told, do not send these people to prison. And so when all of a sudden they are now facing this kind of new pressure, so it takes time to adapt in other way. So maybe this year, the next year, we'll see that this gap will simply grow. But I think a lot of it is bureaucratic inertia, and actually they don't face much. How to say? They don't face threats if they disobey or if they are slow. Yeah, actually, it's expected that law enforcement system is it's conservative, it's slow, it doesn't get things done. That's another thing about the liability to the regime is that every minister who came, every minister of internal affairs came to power and launched a reform, and then it kind of failed, disappeared in whatever direction. So far, the only successful this reform about declining prison population, but that relied on on a political will, on a strong political will and incentive of prison officials to just downsize, to get out of the responsibility for the lives and health of prisoners. So my answer would be, I think it's a slow system, and it takes time to change.
All right, Ellen?
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting, Alexei. I'm also not that very familiar with the judicial system, so it's really interesting for me. And basically, all my questions were asked already. But so my question was, who holds the power? Because we have seen a lot of turnover in terms of ministry. I mean, there's a high reshuffling of ministers in Kazakhstan. So is the Minister of Justice all powerful? If there would be reforms, would the power be in the hands of the Minister of Justice, or is it in the president? And to go a bit further in Karol's question about where is the resistance? And I was wondering if the police themselves are very reluctant, and the KNB, are there powerful actors there that could influence potential reforms or block them or maybe enable them? Another question that I had is that we mentioned the issue of torture quite a few times during the presentation. And if I take the example of Tajikistan, which I know better, there is most of the torture happens not in prisons, but in pre-detention centers, and they are often the target of public anger. So I was wondering if this is also the case here, if torture is systematic in prison or more likely in pre-detention centers where there are fewer witnesses, I guess. And if I can finish with an anecdote about trust in police forces, when I was in Tajikistan, I was apprehended by a policeman. It was a weird situation. I was renting an apartment in Hujan, and he was just looking around to check our Prapiska, yeah, our registration. So he came first. He asked for my documents and I gave him everything. Also asked for my phone number. Wasn't sure it was for personal or political reasons that he was asking, because he was texting me afterwards. And he came back again to check our documents a month later, and I was with guests who were very Salafi looking. So there was an altercation. He was asking for the papers too. He was angry that I was with these people looking very religious. And he finally left. We were joking with my guests that when Tajik police comes, everyone is afraid. Yeah, you know, this means trouble. So they left, and later he came back to my apartment, or he texted me, said, "Come, I'm downstairs." And he wanted to ask me to go for a car ride, which was very weird. And he basically wanted to lecture me about those people, those religious looking people. And I didn't want to go with him. And he told me, he's like, "I'm a policeman. Do you think I will do something bad to you?" I was actually tempted to answer, "Yes, I think I'm going to get into trouble if I go in that car." But yeah, police trust is very low. Yeah, I just wanted to share this anecdote. But yeah, thank you.
Yes, I think you did the right thing, not to go in police.
I actually did. I went actually.
You went?
But nothing happened. He just wanted to lecture me about those fanatics I was supposedly hanging out with. But yeah, so he was true to his words. He didn't mean harm, but very awkward.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. So the first question about who has the power. I mean, you are right about the turnover of personnel. In Kazakhstan specifically, the Minister of Internal Affairs, the previous one, he was in his office, I think, for between 2010 and 2019. So for 9 years he was in the office. So he was very loyal, let's say, or trusted by Nazarbayev. Formally, the role of coordinating all law enforcement is with Procuracy General Office, but so they are kind of elite service, but they do not deal with most crimes. Yeah? And so the most difficult part to reform is the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and so that's, I think, a lot of resistance comes from there. For any type of proposal of reform, there should be approval of different ministries. And so different ministries have their own interests. And so this departmentalism effectively blocks many reforms. So that's, when we talked about torture for police, so in 2018, there was a report about torture, and the police said, well, official statistics for torture show we had 4 cases a year. So they said torture doesn't exist, so we are not going to reform anything. We are not going to open up anything. And so that's, I would say, this resistance to reform is, a lot of it is bureaucratic. Much of it also connects to corruption, of course, because you can extract a lot of money from rich defendants or rich suspects, yeah? Or you can order a criminal case against the competitor, yeah, for money and so forth. So that would be in terms of prevalence of torture. I mean, in Kazakhstan, prison, in prison it really depends on the prison chief or prison guards, how they treat prisoners. So it depends on that. And so, in other words, they are even in one province, in one village which hosts 4 prisons, they may be very different in terms of prevalence of torture. And in Kazakhstan, a lot of torture happens not even in detention cells, but in the offices of police, in police police precincts. Yeah. So that's another area. And there was a proposal to have all police doors made out of glass, transparent. But I don't think it went. It went anywhere. So that's investigating it. Of course, is very difficult. There are cases. So January 22 riots. There are cases of police torture. They are investigated. But already in one city, I think in Talbot-Kurgan, when police officers found out that I think it was KMB or the anti-corruption agency was investigating torture, so they accused someone. They actually went and rioted. They surrendered the office. The colleagues of this person and said, release him, release him, release him. And then they released him and then they went home. Yeah. And so there is this solidarity because all of them know that, if nobody else would protect them. So in that sense, there is that type of community and protecting. And what else? Just one more thing about the political will. How to say it? It varies. Yeah, it's political will in Kazakhstan. It really depends on who has access to the president at a given moment. So if it's somebody who is against torture or some modernizer, then there is this. As long as this person loses access to the offices of president, then somebody else comes in and they announce another. So political will matters, I think, but it's not consistent for the reform.
All right, thank you. Gavin?
Hello, hi, thank you, Brian. Okay, so could I make a couple of comments? So it's not really a question for Alexei, because I'm quite familiar with the topic, obviously, and the presentation. But just for maybe it would be useful to provide a little bit more context, and also just speaking to a couple of points that Karina raised about the performance of criminal justice in Kazakhstan, how well criminal justice is actually carried out by the institutions that are tasked with that. So, I mean, firstly, just to say that this ICVS question about the recidivist burglar, is asked around the world. It's been asked in many different jurisdictions. It's also was in the European Social Survey of 2010. So we can sort of position Kazakhstan and Russia and other former Soviet republics within world public opinion here. And so what we see, basically, to put it in some broader context, is that Kazakhstan and Russia, they're pretty punitive in their desire for prison. So there's a very distinct relationship with incarceration in this part of the world, which we can try and explain that in all sorts of ways. Perhaps it's Gulag legacies, Soviet legacies, and so on. But there seems to be a distinct relationship there. So people in this part of the world tend to desire prison for that particular offender in that vignette to a greater extent than people in other parts of the world, in other parts of Europe. So that's one thing just to bear in mind in terms of where Kazakhstan might stand overall. But that's just in terms of the prison preference, right? So people have this thing of, okay, if somebody commits a crime, throw them in prison, right? Prison is the de facto go-to option. We're not very creative in how we punish in terms of our preferences. It's just prison, put them away. But then, as Karina was saying, this is one of the sort of interesting, I suppose, counterintuitive sort of contradictions in the data, is that what we see is when you ask people, okay, so you want prison, well, what do you want your prisons to do, right? People say, well, we want them to rehabilitate. We want them to be good places that make people better. And we don't want them to inflict pain. We don't want them, to be violent towards prisoners. We want them to treat them with humanity. And then you ask them, okay, well, how well do your prisons do these things? And in Kazakhstan and in Russia, we see respondents say, terribly. Our prison system is terrible. It doesn't rehabilitate anybody. It makes people worse. The conditions are awful. So there's an interesting sort of contradiction here. So it's a risk, right? So if the political will there is to start putting people in prison again after this long period of decarceration, of prison downsizing, you run the risk that you're handing over offenders to this system that we know is abusive, we know tortures, we know makes people worse. And that has the risk of actually then creating a reaction, which the reaction might be that if you have scandals, prison torture scandals, for example, that this might then reduce political support. So it's a strange sort of tightrope that the political leaders are running there if they're thinking about what's the better option, decarcerating and avoiding this untrusted system and trying to minimize its impact on society as much as possible. And on the other hand, everybody's unhappy if you're not putting away burglars. So I just wanted to sort of give a little bit more context there in terms of the findings that we've got, because we do pick up on this, as Karina mentioned, you know, that people are not happy with the way that their prison systems work. So it's a sort of strange thing that then they would say, yes, but put everybody in behind bars. I think that that's partly just because of the way the question is sort of phrased. They're thinking abstractly about this vignette. Okay, there's this burglar. Okay, we'd put them in prison. So I just wanted to give that, and also just as a comment about Karina's question as well about how you change these things. I mean, it's one thing to think about cadres and bringing in new people. I mean, it's another thing I think as just to think about civilian oversight and civil oversight of these institutions. So one thing Alexei and I know very, very well is these places of detention are incredibly opaque. Right? They're very, very non-transparent, and one way you don't necessarily have to change the cadres and the actual people. You don't have to necessarily get all the good people into the prison system. We know that the prison system corrupts people anyway when they start working within it, but just making it more transparent. How do we make it more transparent? I think that's the question we should be asking, because then we can change the incentives and opportunities for behaving in those really pernicious ways, like torturing and utilizing violence against offenders. So that's just a comment. I just wanted to put it out there for a little bit of extra context.
Thanks, Gavin. But the issue is that in 2018 there was only 28% in Kazakhstan respondents who who chose imprisonment for this burglar. So, in other words, we see a drastic and rapid change, turnaround 180 degrees. So that's, I mean, there is a dilemma if you want criminal justice not to punish people. I mean, in other words, as soon as people get in contact with police inside their offices, the probability of being tortured or some kind of scandal, abuse, whatever, corruption, is very high. And so there is this dilemma. You want to have some kind of law and order, so you can just say, okay, people just. We won't capture, we won't search for any criminal. So then there will be fewer scandals and tortures. But if you say no, we have to detect and punish everybody. Then once they get into the system, then all the torture.
And just a brief comment on that. I mean, that's something that's very clear in the data too, from the ICVS and from these other surveys. That so as people come into contact with these institutions, their trust in them decreases. Right? So the more that you interact with the police, the more you, as Hélène said in her anecdote, the more you interact with these institutions, the more likely it is that you'll not have trust in them. So if you really, from the perspective of the government, you would want to actually reduce the number of interactions people are having. And that would also include vicarious interactions, right? So you don't want someone in your family saying, well, yeah, I was in a CISO, I was suspected of a crime and I got tortured to confess, because these vicarious experiences as well are very important. And vicarity now is a much bigger thing, of course, with the advent of YouTube videos and social media. So it's a very dangerous game you're playing if you start to enhance and ramp up the powers of your criminal justice system when it's corrupt and abusive. Yeah, so this is what you're basically. This is a great presentation. It's what you're advertising, really.
Alexei, can I ask a question about the security state infrastructure? Like, wasn't it around 2018 that most of these public cameras started being installed all throughout the major cities? How does this relate to this problem? Because on one hand, I could see this as a sort of a trade-off. The public is willing to accept this intrusion for a promise of greater security. And so when crimes go unreported, maybe they feel more aggrieved that they've sacrificed their privacy for the sake of a public good that isn't materializing on one hand. And then on the second hand, what about the prisons themselves? I mean, that's quite an infrastructural cost to build new prisons to match this new demand. So it seems like, can the government fulfill this demand, in terms of the financial burdens, or I mean, is this why we're seeing them taking these alternative strategies?
Yeah, that's a good point. In terms of the cameras, I mean, President Tokayev really loves cameras. He praised China for total surveillance. And he wants, I think, to imitate it. Plus, it gives a lot of opportunities for enrichment when these cameras are procured at 3 times the cost, the actual cost. The issue is that in Kazakhstani society, the expectation of privacy is very low. Like they place value of privacy is very low. I mean, the family life, neighbors, friends, relatives. So I think they did once a survey. I think from the University of Washington, they ran a survey about privacy, online privacy, and surveillance online, and I think 90% of Kazakhstani said, "Yeah, we're okay. If government watches after us online." So in that sense, for them, it's not a real dilemma. In terms of prison, I mean, they are building new prisons slowly. Again, it's a part of. Again, it allows enrichment for people who are involved in construction industry. And so that's building a new prison, of course, it's expensive. It's much more expensive. They'd rather not. And so, I mean, at this point, there is still, they are not overcrowded, the existing prisons. But if the prison population keeps going up, at some point it will be on the agenda. But I think I don't think it's an urgent issue now on the mind of people. And you're right, prison population decline is driven in part by the financial considerations. This is true in other countries too. That Minister of Finance basically decides on how many prisoners you can handle and so forth. That's a good point.
Okay. So, I'm sorry. Did you continue?
No. I just saw that some questions in the chat.
That's what I was going to. So you can go ahead and take a look at those and read them out.
So, yeah, Maya asked about experimental methods and focus groups. So in the part of this project used focus groups. They were asking some other questions. And so we have focus group data. Experimental methods we did not use, but it would be very good to include them. And then Akjol is asking about the reorganization of KNB. I mean, again, this was announced that KNB would be reformed, but I do not know. At this point, I think the idea is to make it more like FSB in Russia, I think. So they're talking about competency, the competence, yeah? So it would not simply be nepotism in recruitment and hiring, but actual analytical work. So in this sense, I think the reform, is going. And then, of course, militarization, so that the law enforcement officers, including KNB officers, have to have modern equipment, which again will be procured at a very high cost and allow some enrichment opportunity and so forth. So I do not see. I mean, we have examples of Ukraine where the former KGB was reformed after Euromaidan. So that's possibly one one potential way of meaningful reform. And Milan is asking about conviction rate. So so conviction rate in Kazakhstan has been increasing. It's I would say it's about the same. Sometimes the conviction rate is measured by the rate of acquittals in criminal cases, and this rate, you know, it's below 1% in Russia, in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, and so there is, I would say, Kazakhstan is, you know, in somewhere in the middle. It's not different. In terms of imprisonment rate, so in Russia we have about 30% defendants sentenced to prison. In Kazakhstan it's 41%, as I showed. So it's grown since the last 4 years, and so that's a little bit higher than, you know, as of today than in Russia. In Kazakhstan, it was popular in the, you know, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it was popular to resolve a lot of cases based on reconciliation with victims. So that when the defendant would not have a sentence, would be released because of he compensated the victim, apologized, and so forth. But now, after President Tokayev came to power, more and more of crimes are no longer eligible. Criminal cases are eligible for this reconciliation. So judges have no other option as to give a sentence, and therefore more and more the sentence is prison sentence. So I would say Kazakhstan is not particularly different from other countries. Okay.
All right. Are there any last questions? We have about 2 minutes left. Anything left unsaid? All right. Well, thank you, Alexei, for your talk, and stay tuned, everyone, for our final PSIR faculty lecture, which will happen next month. I'll be sending out an announcement in the coming weeks. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.